They tried to tie my hands with paper. 12 pages. Signed by no one. Written by strangers. A script of surrender. Read it. President Traoré. They said, "This is how you survive." But I am not here to survive. I am here to speak. To speak for the silenced. For those whose voices have been stolen for 400 years. They wanted me to apologize for truth. They wanted me to kneel before diplomats who call death defense, who call theft trade, who call war peace. They sent emissaries at dawn, drafted speeches, threatened sanctions, bribed with aid. But no threat can bend a spine that refuses to bow. I took their script. I folded it in half. I looked at the faces in the room, delegates from 100 nations, smug, confident, certain they had already won. They did not know that what I carry is heavier than threats. It is centuries of silence, injustice, and stolen dignity. Tomorrow, I step to the podium, not with their words, but with mine, and the world will hear Africa for the first time, not meek, not apologetic, not small. The night before, the calls came at impossible hours, from Paris, from Washington, from Tel Aviv. Each voice calm, polite, insidious. "Consider your words carefully," they whispered. "An apology preserves partnerships. A misstep invites isolation." They did not understand that we had survived far worse than isolation. They did not understand that survival is meaningless if dignity is sacrificed. A black SUV arrived at the palace without warning. No flags, no diplomatic plates. Inside sat a man who claimed he represented power, though his eyes betrayed panic. He laid out satellite images of our mines, financial documents of Chinese infrastructure deals, intelligence reports of Russian advisors we had never publicly acknowledged. "We know everything," he said, and yet they believed that fear could compel honesty, that intimidation could replace centuries of silenced voices. I leaned back. "And what do you call this?" I asked, pointing to their carefully constructed dossiers. "Cooperation." The ambassador smiled faintly. "Call it what you will, but think carefully. Your speech tomorrow, soften it. Preserve your alliances." I smiled. "2. Tell me," I said, "did your nations apologize when they invaded Iraq? Or bombed Mali? Or leveled Gaza schools?" Silence. I knew then that this was not about diplomacy. It was about precedent. Every apology they forced would become a leash on every African voice that followed. Every concession would whisper that truth could be negotiated, dignity could be conditional, and I would not be the one to teach that lesson. As the sun rose, I walked through Ouagadougou's streets. Children ran alongside my convoy, holding homemade signs. Old women wept openly. Young men chanted, their voices raw with hope and pride. "They think we will apologize." I told them, "They think Africa is still the continent that begs permission to speak. They are wrong." Their eyes burned with recognition. This moment was bigger than me. It was bigger than Burkina Faso. By the time I reached the airport, my mind was clear. No script, no apology, no compromise. The world thought they had engineered my submission, but they were blind to the strategy hidden in plain sight. I would appear compliant in whispers and rumors, while the truth waited for its stage. For decades, our people had been told to shrink, to make themselves small. Tomorrow, they would see what refusal looks like. And yet, even as hope surged, a shadow lingered. Powerful forces were moving unseen, allies and adversaries alike preparing to punish audacity. Every camera, every microphone, every press release could become a weapon against us. The stakes were monumental, not for me, but for every African who had been told to apologize simply for existing. Tomorrow, when I step to the podium at the United Nations, I will not represent a single nation. I will represent centuries of silenced voices. The mothers whose cries were ignored, the children told their dreams were secondary, the communities pressured into subservience. I will speak not with fear, not with caution, not with compromise. I will speak with the weight of history on my shoulders and the fire of freedom in my heart. And the world will learn, for the first time in generations, that Africa will not bow. As I adjusted the microphone, I could feel every eye upon me. Would they hear only a man from Burkina Faso, or the voice of millions who had been waiting their entire lives to speak? The moment of truth had arrived. long before the halls of the United Nations ever saw me. Before Western emissaries sent their scripts and threats, I was just a boy in Ouagadougou. The streets were dusty, the air heavy, with the scent of earth and smoke from distant fires. Children played with sticks and tin cans, pretending they were rifles, imitating battles they did not understand. I watched them, knowing one day the real battles would not be games. My family lived modestly, in a house that had seen independence rise and fall in whispers. My father, a man of quiet dignity, taught me that words are weapons as sharp as any blade. My mother, resilient and fierce, reminded me daily that survival is nothing without respect. "Do not bow," she would say, pressing a hand to my forehead. "Do not beg. Speak, even when the world demands silence." I carried that lesson in my bones. School was a battlefield of another kind. History lessons spoke of kings and generals, but never of the injustices endured in our villages, the invisible wars waged by foreign powers on African soil. I began to see patterns: how borders were drawn without consent, how promises of aid were often chains disguised as generosity. By the time I was a teenager, I understood that compliance was easy, courage was rare. I remember the droughts, the endless heat that cracked the earth and wilted our crops. Families went hungry, and the world looked away. I saw neighbors begging for crumbs from foreign programs. Their dignity quietly eroded. Anger and sorrow burned together inside me, a twin flame that would never extinguish. "We are worth more," I whispered to myself, again and again. "We deserve more than crumbs. We deserve to be heard." It was in those years that I discovered strategy. I watched local leaders negotiate with distant powers, learning the language of compromise, the art of persuasion. But I also saw their limits, their fear of reprisal. That fear would never be mine. I studied maps, trade routes, letters from embassies, anything I could get my hands on. Knowledge, I realized, was a kind of freedom. It was armor. By the time I joined the military academy, I had already made choices that defined me. I refused to turn my back on the suffering around me. I refused to obey orders that betrayed our people. And when I rose through the ranks, I did so not for power, but to ensure that when the time came, I would stand where decisions were made, and I would speak truth without hesitation. Even then, there were betrayals, friends who became rivals, mentors who whispered caution while complicit in injustice. Every betrayal was a test. Every test strengthened me. I learned that loyalty is earned, not assumed. That fear is a tool, not a master. That silence is the most dangerous prison of all. The market squares of Ouagadougou, the classrooms, the dusty roads, all were my training grounds. I learned patience watching vendors haggle with foreign merchants, calculating every word and gesture. I learned diplomacy from village elders, who balanced local disputes with wisdom older than any law written on paper. I learned courage in the quiet hours, when mothers prayed over me and fathers nodded, silently entrusting the future to my resolve. By the time I was elected president, I carried the weight of generations. I carried the lessons of Ouagadougou's alleys, the voices of mothers and children, the history that had been erased from textbooks. I carried anger, yes, but also clarity. I knew the world would try to bind me, to script my words, to measure my courage with threats and dollars. But I had already made a choice that began in Ouagadougou's shadows, among the dust and heat, long before any diplomat had ever dared speak to me. That choice was simple. That choice was unyielding. I would not bow. I would not apologize. And I would not surrender the dignity of my people. And now, standing in the palace office that evening, listening to the reports of Western emissaries plotting and whispering, I understood. The fight that began in Ouagadougou had followed me to the very gates of the United Nations. The question was no longer who would speak, but who would finally be brave enough to listen. The boy from Ouagadougou had grown, but the lessons of his streets and markets remained etched into his bones. I learned early that power is not given. It is seized. Quietly, deliberately. The same hands that dug in the soil, carried water, or lifted heavy baskets, could also grasp opportunity, strategy, and, ultimately, destiny. Every setback, every injustice witnessed in my youth became a building block for the man I would become. Military academy was another world, yet it was no less revealing. Orders came cloaked in authority, discipline enforced with precision, yet often morality was absent. I saw peers obey commands that would harm our people. I chose differently. I questioned. I pushed. Every defiance was subtle, calculated, a whisper against the prevailing silence. The academy taught tactics, but Ouagadougou had already taught me loyalty and courage. I realized that true leadership is not in following commands, it is in shaping them. By the time I entered political life, betrayal had become familiar. Allies turned to rivals in a heartbeat. Mentors who once offered guidance whispered caution, while complicit in systemic oppression. Each encounter was a test, each decision a weighing of consequences. I learned that silence can be a weapon, but also a prison, and I resolved never to be imprisoned by fear, nor to let my people be. I observed, with growing clarity, the subtle ways power was manipulated against us. Foreign aid, promised as lifelines, often came tethered with strings invisible to the untrained eye. Trade agreements, infrastructure projects, even development programs, all tools to reshape Africa's autonomy into dependency. I mapped it in my mind. Piece by piece, I saw the patterns, and I understood that survival without sovereignty is nothing but quiet servitude. It was during this period that I began to gather my circle. Trusted confidants, advisors who shared my vision of an unbowed Africa, people willing to speak truths others dared not. They were engineers, farmers, educators, farmazoljas, and young activists. Together, we began quietly restructuring the way our nation approached every external partnership. Chinese engineers redesigned our telecommunications to serve our people first. Russian agricultural experts revolutionized farming methods with locally adapted techniques. Iranian medical companies built facilities that would free us from foreign aid. Each step was deliberate, invisible to those who believed Africa could be controlled. The lesson was clear. Independence is achieved quietly, patiently, with precision. But when the world believes you are meek, the stage is set for revelation. That revelation would come in New York, but it began here, in Ouagadougou. In the boardrooms, in whispered strategy sessions, in the very choice to reject silence as a survival tactic. I learned early that fear is a language the powerful speak fluently, hoping the meek will understand it first. Ambassadors, emisarios, the foreign ministers, they all believed intimidation would bend me. I understood their methods because I had studied them, catalogued them, and prepared responses for every eventuality. I saw that diplomacy often masquerades as civility, but is frequently a form of coercion, and I was determined to rewrite that script. Even within my own cabinet, tension simmered. Ministers counseled caution, advisors warned of sanctions, threats, and isolation. Mr. President, they said, we must maintain relationships. We cannot risk the wrath of powerful nations. I listened, weighing each argument, and then I made my decision. Relationships built on fear are worthless. Alliances that demand apology for truth are meaningless. We would not compromise dignity for comfort. Every action I took was an echo of Ouagadougou, the streets where mothers raised their voices against injustice, the classrooms where teachers instilled knowledge, the market squares, where the value of our labor was debated daily. I carried those echoes into strategy meetings, cabinet sessions, and diplomatic briefings. They reminded me that Africa's story cannot be dictated by outsiders, that sovereignty is measured not in treaties signed under duress, but in the courage to refuse oppression. By the end of that phase, I was no longer just a leader. I was a symbol, not of recklessness, but of disciplined defiance. Every calculated move, every quietly implemented reform, had prepared me for the moment when I would face the world without apology, and I knew, in the quiet hours before the UN speech, that the foundations laid in Ouagadougou, forged in silence and struggle, were ready to be revealed. As I reviewed the final preparations in my office, the reports came in. Every Western embassy had been briefed on my supposed softening of stance. They believed victory was near. They could not see the truth. Not yet that the boy from Ouagadougou, forged in silence, was about to speak for millions who had been denied a voice for centuries. The question remained, Would the world finally understand what it means when Africa refuses to apologize? 3 days before I was scheduled to address the United Nations, the first letter arrived. 12 pages, carefully typed, signed by no one, yet claiming authority over my words. It was polite, civil, deadly. Each paragraph was a lesson in manipulation. They told me exactly what they expected. Apologize for tone. Apologize for language. Reaffirm shared values. Whose values? Certainly not ours. Calls followed. From Paris, from Washington, from Tel Aviv. Each representative spoke calmly, evenly, but beneath the surface, urgency crackled like electricity. Consider carefully. Mr. President, they said, a misstep could cost partnerships. Your nation's aid could be reconsidered. Sanctions are possible. Coopération dépend en compliance. I listened, quietly, noting every word. Their confidence revealed their assumption that fear could bend me. They had no idea how deeply I had trained for this moment. The night grew long. At 2 a.m., my personal phone rang, one that only 5 people had access to. A voice, smooth and unfamiliar, said, President Traoré, this is Ambassador Richardson from the U.S. State Department. We need to talk. 20 minutes later, a black SUV without flags or plates pulled up outside the palace. Ambassador Richardson stepped out with 2 men who refused introductions. They were here not as guests, but as enforcers of expectation. Inside my office, Richardson laid out the evidence: satellite photos of our gold mines, financial records of Chinese infrastructure deals, intelligence reports on Russian military advisors. We know everything, he said quietly. Then came the subtle threat. Your speech tomorrow doesn't need to be confrontational. You can make your point while preserving partnerships. I leaned back, watching him carefully. Tell me, I said, when your country invaded Iraq, did you apologize first? When France intervened in Mali, did they ask African consent? When Israel bombs schools, do they draft apologies? Silence filled the room. That was when it became clear. This was not about diplomacy. It was about precedent. They wanted my apology to teach every African leader. Truth is negotiable. Dignity is optional. And they believed that fear would compel submission. What they did not understand is that decades of silence had forged a spine unbreakable. I left the room with no answer, but with a plan. For 6 months, my team and I had been quietly restructuring every major international partnership. Chinese engineers were redesigning our telecommunications network, Russian agricultural specialists transforming local farming, Iranian pharmaceutical companies building medical infrastructure for complete self-sufficiency. Every move was invisible to them. Every detail was calculated to prepare for the moment we would stand without apology. The following day, Western news outlets began reporting rumors. President Traoré was reconsidering. He might soften his stance. CNN ran headlines speculating compromise. BBC quoted anonymous diplomats suggesting openness. Across Washington, Paris, and Tel Aviv, celebrations were quietly held. They believed victory was near. What they didn't know was that we were performing a different kind of strategy, one that required patience, subtlety, and courage. Meanwhile, at home, the people of Ouagadougou and across Burkina Faso were already feeling the pulse of change. In Revolution Square, thousands gathered, not for protest, not for applause, but to bear witness. Mothers held children above their heads. Young men and women chanted in unison. The electricity in the air was tangible. They did not yet know the full speech, but they knew the principle. We would not apologize for being African. By the evening, I had called my security chief. How many Western intelligence operatives are under surveillance? 17 confirmed. Probably double that we haven't identified. How many phone lines are they monitoring? All of them. Then leak the story. I said, suggest I'm having second thoughts. Let them believe the plan has faltered. Let them celebrate their anticipated victory. They must never know the truth until the right moment. And the right moment was coming. I could feel it. The world had already begun to misunderstand me. They assumed caution. They assumed submission. They assumed a scripted apology would bend us. But Ouagadougou had taught me otherwise. the streets, the mothers, the elders, they had all prepared me for this exact confrontation. The challenge was not to speak. The challenge was to make them listen. Even before stepping onto foreign soil, I realized the war I was fighting was invisible. It was not fought with guns or tanks, but with whispers, paper, and satellites. Western intelligence agencies had eyes everywhere. Every phone line, every message, every movement tracked, analyzed, and reported. They believed that their surveillance would control us, that fear would shape our actions. They were wrong. For 6 months, my team and I had quietly mapped every infiltration, every operative, every back channel. 17 known Western agents were under surveillance in Ouagadougou. The true number was likely double, hidden, in plain sight. Every phone line they monitored was feeding them false information. Every rumor planted was designed to mislead, confuse, and lull them into complacency. By the time they realized, it would be too late. The night I received Ambassador Richardson's visit, it became clear how desperate they were. The dossier of satellite images, financial records, and intelligence reports was impressive, but it was also an admission of panic. They had studied us meticulously, believing their power could bend a young African president to their will. And yet, in their overconfidence, they had overlooked the one factor no technology could measure: determination, forged in generations of oppression. In our war room, maps covered the walls, colored pins marked every strategic location. Reports of foreign communications, economic negotiations, and diplomatic maneuvers were stacked neatly, prioritized by risk. My advisors, hand-picked for loyalty and insight, worked alongside me like a shadow army. We studied patterns, anticipated moves, and calculated responses. This was a war of minds, and I intended to win it. Even our daily routines were crafted as strategy. Visits to rural areas were opportunities to test communication networks. Agricultural initiatives became tools for demonstrating independence. Every small success was reported, exaggerated, and, if necessary, subtly leaked to Western observers to manipulate expectations. Richardson and his counterparts believed they were steering the narrative, but they were merely actors in a play we had written. The people of Burkina Faso were unknowingly participants in this invisible campaign. Children who practiced speeches in local languages, mothers who organized communal gardens, farmers experimenting with traditional irrigation methods, they were all part of a broader strategy to reclaim autonomy. Every step taken locally had a ripple effect that reached international capitals without leaving a trace of manipulation. During one briefing, my security chief asked, "Sir, what kind of message should we leak about your UN speech?" I looked at him and said, "The kind that suggests doubt. The kind that makes them think I might read their apology." The chief nodded. By morning, every embassy from Cairo to Brussels had reports circulating. Burkina Faso's president may reconsider. Headlines speculated on potential compromise. State departments celebrated their supposed victory. None of them knew they were dancing to our tune. This invisible war required patience. It required understanding that power is often assumed, not earned. The Western powers relied on centuries of precedent, conditioned thinking that African nations would always yield under pressure. They underestimated the training that began in the alleys and classrooms of Ouagadougou, where survival meant observing, calculating, and speaking only when necessary. Yet, despite the careful choreography, there was a constant tension. One wrong move, one premature reveal, and the entire strategy could collapse. The weight of generations hung on every decision. I carried not just my own fate, but the expectations of millions who had been silenced. This was why every call, every meeting, every leaked rumor had to be precise. A single misstep could undo months of preparation. By the time the UN podium awaited, the stage was set. The world believed it had already dictated the terms of our behavior. They expected a submission, a scripted apology, a concession dressed in diplomacy. What they did not realize was that the greatest victories are often invisible until the moment they are revealed. As I reviewed the final intelligence reports that evening, I traced the connections between every operative, every leak, every rumor, and I smiled. The invisible war had been fought in silence, and tomorrow, at the UN, the first visible strike would fall. But would the world be ready to witness an Africa that refuses to apologize? The morning sun had barely risen when the first emissaries arrived. Black SUVs glided silently up the palace drive, their presence both formal and ominous. Ambassador Richardson returned. This time, not alone, accompanied by aides whose faces revealed nothing but purpose. They did not smile. They did not greet. They came to remind us that Africa's silence had always been expected. Inside the office, Richardson laid out the stakes clearly. Your speech at the UN, he began, need not be confrontational. You can make your point while maintaining partnerships. Consider this, your opportunity for compromise. He tapped a folder containing intelligence briefs, financial projections, and even private communications. We know every move you've made in restructuring your partnerships. We know every step, every decision. And yet, he paused. There is still time to soften the message. I looked at him, and for a long moment, only silence spoke. Softening. I repeated, is that what you call centuries of stolen dignity? Is that what you call voices silenced? Children taught to beg for crumbs. Nations forced to kneel. Softening is for the weak. We are neither weak nor compliant. He leaned forward, his voice low. Mr. President, think carefully. Sanctions are not idle threats. Aid can be reconsidered. Isolation can be imposed. You could jeopardize everything you've built. I studied the files on the desk, noting how meticulously they had followed every move of our development projects. Every negotiation with Chinese engineers, Russian agricultural experts, Iranian pharmaceutical companies. They believed knowledge equals control. They were wrong. You speak of jeopardy, I said, finally breaking the silence. When your countries bomb schools in Gaza, when France intervenes in Mali without consent, when Africa is forced into dependency for decades, is that not jeopardy too? Are those the risks that concern you, or merely the discomfort of an African leader speaking truthfully? My words hung in the room like a storm about to break. Richardson's aides exchanged subtle glances. One hand rested on the briefcase, ready to lift it, to retreat, to leave. But I knew the threat was not in their posture, it was in their assumption that fear could bend me. And that assumption had been the error of every foreign power that had ever underestimated Africa's resolve. For the next hour, the conversation oscillated between veiled threats and calculated persuasion. They offered generous reconsiderations of aid, subtle hints that partnerships are fragile, and even whispered promises of economic reward. I nodded occasionally, appearing measured, attentive, even cautious. But inside, each word reinforced the plan. Let them think submission is possible. Let them measure my patience as weakness. I recalled the lessons from Ouagadougou, the markets, the classrooms, the dusty streets, where patience and observation were as valuable as courage. Every action had been a rehearsal for this confrontation. Every negotiation had been a strategy session disguised as routine governance. Every moment of restraint had been training. Now, at this pinnacle, patience and discipline would dictate the terms. Finally, Richardson closed his briefcase, his smile tight, brittle. Mr. President, you are a smart man. Make the smart choice. I leaned back, letting the weight of history and preparation settle. Smart, I said, is not measured by compliance. Smart is measured by integrity, by the courage to speak for those who have never been heard. That is the choice I have made. As they left, their silence was heavier than any words they could have spoken. I watched the SUVs vanish down the palace driveway, imagining the ripple of panic that would follow in international capitals. They believed they had left me isolated, alone in my convictions. They could not see that Africa itself was standing behind me every street, every market, every mother and child who had learned they need not apologize for being. That evening, in the quiet of my office, I reviewed every note, every strategy, every warning. The invisible war had been fought. The emissaries had delivered their threats. The stage was set. Yet, I felt neither fear nor doubt. Instead, a calm clarity settled over me. The world believed it could control the narrative with threats and whispered promises. They had underestimated the weight of preparation, the depth of resolve, and the power of a people finally refusing to be silenced. As night fell over Ouagadougou, A single thought echoed through my mind. Tomorrow, the world would hear Africa speak, not politely, not apologetically, but without compromise. The question remained, would they understand the magnitude of what it meant when a continent finally refused to bow? The Atlantic stretched beneath the plain like a vast, silent witness. Each mile closer to New York brought a wave of anticipation, tension, and defiance. For weeks, Western powers had plotted, whispered, and assumed. They believed they had measured my intentions, that they had anticipated compliance. They were wrong. When the wheels touched down at JFK, a surprise awaited. Outside the airport, not protesters against me, but supporters for Africa, for dignity. 200 Africans, young and old, had gathered spontaneously, signs waving. Africa doesn't apologize here. Traoré speaks for us. Their voices rose in chants, raw with hope, pride, and impatience. The roar was electric, filling the space between tarmac and sky with a power no diplomat could calculate. The motorcade moved slowly through the streets of New York. Students ran alongside, waving, shouting, urging me to make them hear us. Mothers held their children high. Fathers lifted signs above their heads. Every cheer, every beat of their hearts was a reminder that this moment was no longer mine alone. It belonged to every African who had been told to shrink, to apologize, to be silent. Inside the vehicle, I allowed myself a rare smile. Years of preparation, of strategy, of invisible maneuvering, had led to this instant. Western agencies thought they controlled the narrative. Every leak, every rumor about second thoughts had played into their assumptions. They believed I might read their scripted apology. They did not know that by the time I reached the podium, the truth would be revealed. Africa speaks for itself. Arriving at the United Nations headquarters, the enormity of the moment settled in. Delegates from over 100 nations sat waiting, some smug, others indifferent, most confident that the young leader from Burkina Faso would comply. Cameras swiveled, microphone poised. But for the first time in decades, an African president would step to the podium without fear, without compromise, without apology. The lobby was a flurry of diplomatic staff, aides, and press. Each step I took echoed with the memory of Ouagadougou, the dusty streets, the market squares, the classrooms where truth had been taught quietly but powerfully. Every decision, every initiative, every silent struggle to reclaim our sovereignty culminated here. This was not just a speech. It was the manifestation of centuries of silenced voices finding expression. As I ascended the steps into the General Assembly Hall, the air thickened with expectation. Delegates shifted in their seats, some leaning forward, others glancing sideways, murmuring into earpieces. The applause was polite, restrained, calculated. They expected decorum. They expected a measured acknowledgement of their influence. They expected submission. I found the podium, adjusted the microphone once, and looked over the chamber. Hundreds of eyes met mine, Kamera Zulmed, broadcasting across continents. And in that instant, I felt the weight of every African who had been told they were less, that their voices were inconsequential, that truth required permission. Every whisper, every prayer, every moment of silent defiance in Ouagadougou now pressed upon my shoulders. Yet, I did not falter. I did not glance at the papers they had prepared, nor consider the scripts they had drafted. I carried only one set of words, those forged over years of struggle, patience, observation, and unwavering commitment to dignity. The world assumed this speech was about me. It was not. It was about us. It was about reclaiming the right to speak without fear, to act without apology, to exist without seeking permission. Outside the hall, the city hummed. Reporters, students, activists, all had sensed the magnitude of the moment. They did not yet know the content, but they understood the principle. Africa was rising, not in whispers, not in negotiations, but with an unyielding voice that refused to bend. As I cleared my throat and prepared to speak, the chamber fell silent. Every diplomat, every press photographer, every observer waited for the words of a president who was expected to apologize. The question hung in the air. Would they hear the words scripted, for submission, or the truth that would shake the foundation of their assumptions? The chamber was silent. Over 100 nations sat, cámaras puestas, microphones ready, all anticipating the expected apology. I adjusted the microphone, unfolded my own notes. Just a few scribbled lines, personal reminders, nothing drafted by foreign hands. This was my moment, and the world thought it had already scripted it for me. I began, "Before you ask me to apologize, let me ask you something. How many times has Africa apologized for the crimes done to it? How many times have you expressed regret for the stolen generations, for borders drawn without consent, for children left to starve under your policies?" The silence was immediate and heavy. Heads shifted uncomfortably. Some smirked. Some froze. Some turned away. I recounted the abuses, the manipulations, the false narratives that had been imposed upon Africa for decades. I spoke of Israel, of France, of economic policies that kept nations dependent. I reminded them of Gaza, of Mali, of Congo, and Niger, drawing parallels to every cry that had gone unheard. "We will not remain silent," I said, voice steady but forceful, "because silence is complicity, and we will not be complicit any longer." I pulled out my phone, showing a message from a child in Ouagadougou. "Mr. President, my teacher says you're going to speak for us. Please don't let them make you small. We are proud to be African." The chamber went still. Even the most seasoned diplomats shifted nervously. Cameras zoomed in. Every eye turned to the young man from Burkina Faso who was about to defy centuries of expectation. The words poured steadily, unrelenting. "I refuse to apologize for tone. I refuse to apologize for speaking truth. I refuse to compromise African dignity for the comfort of the West." Each sentence was deliberate, each pause a strategic. When France's delegate stood and walked out, I did not flinch. Good. Let him leave. He could not stop history, nor could any nation dictate the moral compass of a people awakened. I spoke of aid disguised as control, of partnerships disguised as subordination. I spoke of generations conditioned to apologize for existence, to shrink, to be grateful for crumbs. I reminded them that Africa would no longer bow, that we would act, decide, and thrive on our own terms. Every word elicited subtle tremors. Delegates whispered into earpieces. Notes were passed quietly. Some shifted uneasily in their seats. The press tried to interpret each nuance, failing to grasp the full magnitude. By the end of the first hour, the UN Assembly was not just listening, they were reckoning. I concluded, "I apologize only for one thing, that it took this long for an African leader to stand here and speak without fear. Everything else, we will not apologize for. We will not apologize for defending our people, for demanding dignity, for existing as proud Africans. If that makes you uncomfortable, then finally, you are beginning to understand how it felt for centuries." The room was stunned. No applause. No interruption. Silence so thick it could be felt. And yet, that silence was electric. Every camera, every microphone, every observer now held the weight of a revelation centuries in the making. For the first time, the world saw not a politician navigating diplomacy, but a continent refusing to be subdued. Outside the hall, the effects were immediate. African Union representatives scrambled to convene an emergency session. Students and citizens across Africa streamed live reactions, sharing videos of themselves inspired by the speech. Market women, farmers, educators, and artists began mobilizing their actions, reflecting a collective awakening. The speech had transcended politics. It had become a movement, and still, in the chamber, the world waited for the moment they expected an apology. A concession, a bow. None came. Only clarity, dignity, and defiance. I had not come to negotiate their comfort, only to ensure that African voices could no longer be ignored, manipulated, or silenced. As I stepped away from the podium, the weight of what had been unleashed began to settle in. Behind every glance, every whisper, every shocked expression, I knew the real reckoning was only beginning. Outside, across continents, millions were watching, ready to act. The question remained, would the world resist, or would Africa finally be heard on its own terms? The world had not anticipated what came next. The UN speech ended, but its echo spread faster than any diplomat, faster than any headline, Across Africa, the moment became a catalyst. Not protests, not riots, not chaos, but action. Deliberate, measured, transformative action. The people had been waiting for permission for generations, and suddenly, it had been granted. In Nairobi, university students organized Dignity Day. Campus-wide discussions sprang up overnight, debating African self-determination, foreign interference, and economic sovereignty. Lectures and workshops turned libraries into arenas of awakening. Students who had only moments ago felt powerless now discussed strategies, mapped resources, and drafted initiatives for local governance. In Lagos, market women began refusing to sell products from companies tied to Israeli settlements. They held meetings in community centers, shared financial records, and educated each other on the subtle chains hidden in trade agreements. "We know the value of our labor," one woman announced to her peers. "We will not sell it cheaply. Not for anyone." Videos of their defiance went viral, reaching millions within hours. In Accra, musicians sampled excerpts from my UN speech in their compositions. Streets filled with sound, drums, voix, guitars, and lyrics, echoing the words of dignity and refusal to apologize. In Cape Town, artists painted murals honoring African leaders from Nkrumah to Mandela. And finally, to me, under the caption, "The Unbroken Chain," public spaces became visual testimonies of resistance and pride. African governments could not ignore the shift. For the first time in decades, policy discussions were driven not by aid negotiations, but by the people's demands. An emergency African Union session convened with unprecedented speed. 43 ambassadors met in Addis Ababa. They debated not trade deals or financial packages, but sovereignty, dignity, and self-determination. Within 48 hours, 12 African presidents signed the New York Declaration, committing their nations to resist conditional aid, to defend sovereignty, and to reject foreign dictates. Meanwhile, Western powers were scrambling. Reports flooded in from embassies. The youth were mobilizing. Citizens were organizing, and the narrative they had expected, submission, apology, compliance, was unraveling. Analysts convened in Washington, Paris, London, trying to assess the sudden psychological shift sweeping the continent, but it was already too late. Africa was no longer waiting. Africa was moving. In my own country, Burkina Faso, the transformation was tangible. Revolution Square became a hub, not of protest, but of reconstruction. Volunteers rebuilt schools without foreign aid. Irrigation channels were restored using local knowledge and tools. Tech labs, funded by diaspora communities, sprang up across neighborhoods. The population realized that independence was not a distant ideal. It was achievable here and now. The psychological impact was just as significant as the material one. Children, for the first time, witnessed leaders who spoke truth without apology. Mothers and elders saw their long-suppressed pride reflected in national action. A grandmother on national television held her grandchild and said, "I am not educated, but today, I am proud to be Burkinab." Across Africa, similar stories emerged, each reinforcing the collective consciousness that dignity was not negotiable. Even the Western press struggled to contain the narrative. Headlines focused on sanctions, smear campaigns, and financial penalties, but they could not capture the awakening, because it was no longer just about me or Burkina Faso. It was about a continent realizing it could act independently, that its voice had value beyond the approval of others. The most telling indicator came from unexpected corners. Indigenous communities in the Americas began referencing the UN speech in land rights campaigns. Aboriginal activists in Australia invoked similar language in sovereignty movements. Pacific Island nations, grappling with climate change and historical colonial legacies, began using Africa's example in international forums. One speech, delivered without fear, had created a ripple effect across the globe. And yet, the real challenge had only begun. Momentum was rising, but resistance was inevitable. Western powers had not yet abandoned hope. Threats, sanctions, and smear campaigns were already underway, but the people had tasted empowerment. They had seen possibility. And that, more than any policy or diplomat, was the force the world could not suppress. As the sun set over the capitals of Africa, I sat in my office in Ouagadougou, reviewing the unfolding changes. Citizens were acting. Nations were moving. History was being rewritten, and I knew the real reckoning was coming. The question lingered: would Africa continue to rise, united, or would the forces of fear and manipulation strike back before the vision could fully take hold? The African Union convened an emergency session. 43 ambassadors gathered in a conference room at the Ethiopian mission to the UN. The atmosphere was electric, charged with decades of suppressed frustration and the weight of history finally breaking free. This was not about trade agreements or conditional aid. This was about sovereignty, dignity, and the refusal to bow to external dictates. The debate was intense. Some nations hesitated, concerned about sanctions, about the optics, about losing favor with powerful Western states. Others, emboldened by my UN speech, argued that Africa could no longer wait for permission to assert its independence. Voices rose, sometimes in anger, sometimes in passionate conviction. Maps, financial reports, and historical documents were spread across tables. Each statistic, each story, each precedent was dissected meticulously. Within 48 hours, 12 African presidents signed what came to be known as the New York Declaration. It was a commitment unprecedented in modern African history. No nation would accept conditional aid. No leader would apologize for defending sovereignty. And foreign powers would no longer dictate domestic policy. For the first time, the continent collectively drew a line, asserting that dignity was not negotiable. The impact was immediate and tangible. In Nairobi, students organized assemblies teaching self-determination and the principles behind the declaration. In Lagos, market women held meetings to ensure fair trade and to educate others on the importance of local empowerment. In Accra, musicians and artists amplified the message through songs and murals, honoring leaders who had fought and those who would continue the struggle. Across cities, towns, and villages, ordinary citizens began to act with a new sense of agency. In Burkina Faso, the response was profound. Revolution Square became a hub of organized civic action rather than protest. Thousands volunteered to rebuild schools without foreign aid, restore irrigation channels, and launch tech labs funded by the diaspora. Communities that had once waited for permission now acted with autonomy and purpose. The psychological shift was as important as the material changes. Africans were no longer waiting, they were leading. Western powers, initially confident, scrambled to contain the momentum. Reports flooded embassies detailing citizen engagement, grassroots mobilization, and policy shifts that challenged the status quo. Analysts and diplomats in Washington, Paris, and London were forced to confront a reality they had dismissed for decades. Africa was no longer predictable, compliant, or subdued. The narrative had changed, and the architects of the old order were on the back foot. The declaration also inspired unprecedented collaboration within the continent. Countries renegotiated resource extraction agreements to ensure a greater share of profits stayed domestically. Sovereign wealth funds were established to capture value from natural resources. Intra-African trade agreements flourished, bypassing traditional Western intermediaries. The African Continental Free Trade Area accelerated implementation, not through bureaucratic negotiations, but because citizens demanded it. The psychological effect rippled globally. Indigenous communities in the Americas, Aboriginal activists in Australia, and Pacific Island nations facing colonial legacies cited the UN speech and the subsequent declaration as a model for self-determination. One African president later remarked, "This is more than a political maneuver. It is a blueprint for dignity." Within Burkina Faso, families celebrated quietly and proudly. Children understood, in a way they never had before, that sovereignty was not abstract. It was a lived experience. Mothers and elders felt empowerment ripple through their communities. "We don't beg anymore," they whispered in markets, schools, and homes. The shift was cultural, spiritual, and practical. Yet even as the declaration ignited hope, the stakes remained high. Western nations began to impose sanctions, freeze funds, and launch media campaigns aimed at undermining the movement. They sought to isolate us, to restore the narrative of dependency, to remind Africa of old hierarchies. But the people had already tasted agency. They were prepared to defend the principles now embedded in hearts and institutions alike. The true measure of change would not be seen in offices or press releases. It would be seen in ordinary citizens acting boldly, in governments asserting independence, and in communities reclaiming control over their destinies. Every action taken in response to the declaration reinforced the message: Africa would no longer kneel, no matter the pressure. As night fell across the continent, messages arrived from capitals across Africa. Policies were shifting, citizens were mobilizing, and a continent once muted was now a chorus of determination. The question loomed: would the Western powers adjust, retaliate, or finally recognize a new Africa rising with unwavering dignity? The morning after the Declaration of Dignity, the response from Western powers was swift and calculated. Development funds were frozen. Financial reviews were postponed. Media outlets began a coordinated narrative, painting Burkina Faso's leader as reckless, untrustworthy, even dictatorial. Think tanks in Washington and London published reports warning of isolation and consequences. Every move we had anticipated, every pressure tactic they could muster, was activated. Yet, their retaliation revealed their panic more than it imposed any real harm. They believed that withholding money, issuing threats, and spinning headlines would break the momentum. They did not understand that the true power had already shifted. Africa was no longer dependent on their validation. We had claimed our voice. The UN speech and the declaration had set off a chain reaction far beyond their control. Across the continent, citizens were watching. Every embargo, every article, every whispered warning from foreign capitals was met with defiance rather than fear. In Kenya, students marched with signs quoting, "The UN speech, he speaks for us." In Nigeria, grassroots activists questioned trade agreements, demanding transparency from multinational companies. In South Africa, lawyers filed cases challenging arms deals and foreign influence in local conflicts. The continent's response was coordinated, empowered, and unstoppable. Even in Burkina Faso, the impact was profound. Revolution Square transformed into a hub of organized civic engagement. Citizens volunteered to rebuild schools without foreign funding. Irrigation projects, previously dependent on international aid, were restored using local labor and indigenous knowledge. Technology labs, funded by diaspora contributions, opened across neighborhoods. Ordinary Africans were now taking ownership of initiatives that had been dictated for decades by foreign powers. Western powers scrambled to reinterpret the narrative. Analysts convened emergency meetings, trying to measure the psychological shift sweeping through Africa. This was supposed to be a warning. One diplomat muttered. Instead, it has inspired action. They had expected submission, not empowerment. Every threat they deployed, every article they published, only underscored the need for independence, reinforcing the message that Africa would not kneel. In Paris, media outlets attempted to frame the story as reckless defiance. In Washington, officials warned of potential instability and economic fallout, yet none could contain the momentum. Across the continent, ordinary citizens and governments alike were implementing changes that could not be undone. The people had tasted possibility, and that taste was now a catalyst for widespread transformation. Even small acts became symbols of independence. Market traders refused to sell underpriced goods to exploitative foreign companies. University students created town halls to teach local governance, self-determination, and economic sovereignty. Artists and musicians amplified the message, using streets, airwaves, and social media to remind everyone of the new narrative. Africa acts for itself, and yet, the tension was undeniable. Western governments continued to apply pressure, hoping that either internal dissent or economic necessity would force compliance. Threats were made quietly to African leaders, calls were placed to allies, and emissaries arrived to remind us of the costs of defiance. Each action was a reminder that the stakes were higher than ever, but the people's response had fundamentally changed the equation. For the first time in decades, African citizens felt they had a stake in policy, a voice in decisions that shaped their lives. Across borders, social media amplified local action into continental awareness. The message was clear. No apology would be given, no submission tolerated, and the old structures of fear and control were no longer effective. As the Western machinery churned behind closed doors, preparing new sanctions and diplomatic maneuvers, I watched the continent mobilize, aware that the real battle was no longer only political. It was psychological, cultural, and generational. The question remained, would Africa sustain this unity in the face of mounting pressure, or would the next wave of retaliation threaten to fracture the movement before it fully matured? Across Africa, ordinary citizens were no longer waiting for permission, they were acting. This was not protest. It was not chaos. It was organized, deliberate, and transformative. In Lagos, market traders refused to sell products under exploitative contracts with foreign companies. They convened early in the morning, whispering to one another about fair pricing, calculating their leverage, and educating their peers. Videos of their actions spread across social media, racking up millions of views, showing a continent unwilling to accept crumbs any longer. In Accra, musicians and artists amplified the message. Streets filled with the sound of drums and voices, repeating words of dignity and resistance. Murals sprang up overnight, depicting African leaders from Nkrumah to Mandela to Traoré, with captions proclaiming the unbroken chain. Galleries and performance spaces hosted workshops, teaching the history of colonial manipulation and strategies for self-determination. Each song, each painting, became a visual and auditory declaration that Africa had awakened. Nairobi's universities became hubs of civic education. Students organized assemblies and town halls, debating governance, trade, and the implications of the New York Declaration. They drafted local policies, mapped resources, and proposed community-led infrastructure projects. Young people, unsaid disillusioned, now recognized that they could shape their future. "We don't need permission," they whispered, echoing the sentiment of the speech that had ignited this awakening. In South Africa, a 16-year-old girl recorded a video outside a former apartheid museum. "My grandmother told me during apartheid they made people apologize for being black," she said, voice steady and determined. "Today, we don't have to apologize anymore. Not for being African, not for demanding respect, not for knowing our worth." Within 48 hours, the video had millions of views. Across the continent, citizens shared similar stories, creating a web of inspiration that no foreign threat could dismantle. Governments began aligning policies with this surge of civic engagement. Zambia renegotiated copper exports to retain a majority of profits domestically. Tanzania implemented local content requirements for mining contracts. In Sahel, French military bases were given 90 days to vacate. These moves were not isolated. They represented a coordinated shift towards sovereignty and independence, reflecting a people who had reclaimed their agency. Burkina Faso exemplified the change at the grassroots level. Revolution Square became a hub of constructive activity, rebuilding schools without foreign aid, restoring irrigation systems using local knowledge, and establishing technology labs funded by the diaspora. Volunteers worked side by side, mothers, fathers, and children, each understanding that independence was achievable when communities trusted their own resources and wisdom. The psychological impact was profound. Generations of Africans had been taught to apologize for existing, to accept subordination silently. Now, children witnessed leaders who spoke truthfully without compromise. Elders saw their lifelong struggles validated. Communities realized that action, not words from foreign powers, determined their destiny. Even outside Africa, the movement reverberated globally. Indigenous communities in the Americas referenced the UN speech and declaration in their campaigns for land rights. Aboriginal activists in Australia invoked similar language in sovereignty movements, Pacific Island nations, confronting colonial legacies and climate crises, began adapting African strategies to assert independence. The speech had become a blueprint for global empowerment. From my office in Ouagadougou, I observed the momentum with a mix of awe and calculation. Every grassroots action, every government policy, every viral video was a confirmation that centuries of silence had ended. Citizens were awake, engaged, and empowered. The power of Africa was no longer latent. It was visible, deliberate, and unstoppable. Yet, the stakes remained high. Western governments scrambled to respond sanctions, media campaigns, diplomatic pressure. But the psychological shift was irreversible. Citizens had tasted agency, and that taste had ignited a movement that could not be contained by intimidation. As dusk settled over African capitals, a continent once muted was now a chorus of determination. Governments acted, citizens mobilized, and history was being rewritten in real time. The looming question: could Africa sustain this unity in the face of mounting retaliation? Or would the old powers attempt to fracture the movement before its momentum became irreversible? The awakening was no longer confined to individual cities or nations. It had become a continental force, a surge of determination that swept across Africa. Governments, communities, and ordinary citizens were moving in concert, inspired by a single truth: Africa would no longer bow, apologize, or seek permission to exist with dignity. The ripple effect was undeniable. In Lagos, market traders convened before dawn. They whispered among themselves, calculating fair prices, discussing contracts with foreign companies, and educating newcomers about collective bargaining. A young woman named Amina addressed the crowd, her voice steady. "We know the value of our work. We will not sell it cheaply. Not for anyone." By evening, videos of her leadership went viral, reaching millions across Nigeria and beyond, sparking similar movements in neighboring towns. In Accra, artists and musicians amplified the message. Streets filled with drums, guitars, and chants repeating words of dignity and resistance. Murals depicting African leaders from Nkrumah to Mandela to Traoré appeared overnight, captioned "The Unbroken Chain." Galleries and community centers hosted workshops on history, civic engagement, and self-determination, merging education with culture in a tangible statement of empowerment. Nairobi's universities became hubs of civic action. Students organized town halls, debated local governance, and drafted proposals for community-led infrastructure projects. Social media connected activists across East Africa, creating a continent-wide network of engaged youth. One student, speaking to a live stream, said, "We have waited for centuries. Now we speak. Now we act." Across cities, ordinary citizens mirrored this resolve in tangible initiatives, from local water projects to cooperative farming. In Tanzania, farmers and agricultural cooperatives asserted control over exports, negotiating directly with buyers rather than through intermediaries. Market women taught workshops on collective bargaining and pricing transparency. Traditional irrigation techniques, once dismissed as primitive, were revived and scaled across villages. Each step was deliberate, a fusion of heritage, strategy, and defiance that directly challenged decades of dependency. South Africa witnessed a remarkable fusion of environmental activism and sovereignty advocacy. Elders shared lessons of colonial land dispossession, while youth applied modern tools to map, monitor, and reclaim land resources. Local councils implemented sustainability programs rooted in traditional knowledge, creating a model where heritage and innovation coexisted. Streets and public forums became arenas for civic education, citizen engagement, and direct action. Even smaller towns felt the ripple. Local councils restructured budgets to prioritize citizen-led initiatives. Schools integrated lessons on sovereignty, and farmers collectively managed natural resources. Communities learned that governance was no longer a distant abstraction. It was a responsibility they could exercise immediately. Every initiative reinforced the continent-wide message: Africa decides for itself. The African Union, observing these developments, took decisive action. Policies were revised to protect local industries, regulate foreign investments, and empower indigenous knowledge systems. Countries shared intelligence and strategies, creating networks of regional cooperation, independent of Western intermediaries. The UN speech and declaration had provided the spark, but continental coordination ensured its sustainability. The ripple extended globally. Indigenous communities in the Americas cited Africa's example in campaigns for land rights. Aboriginal activists in Australia applied the same principles to sovereignty movements. Pacific Island nations facing colonial legacies and climate crises adapted African strategies to assert local control over resources. What began as a refusal to apologize had transformed into a blueprint for global self-determination. From my office in Ouagadougou, I observed the momentum with awe and calculation. Every viral video, every workshop, every policy shift confirmed a profound truth. Centuries of silence had ended. Citizens were awake, empowered, and acting. The power of Africa was no longer latent. It was deliberate, visible, and unstoppable. This is what we were always capable of. I thought, this is what happens when a people refuse to be silent. Even as Western powers scrambled, imposing sanctions and orchestrating media campaigns, the momentum could not be contained. Analysts and diplomats tried to measure the psychological shift sweeping the continent. Their threats only strengthened resolve. Citizens had tasted agency, and that taste ignited. A movement no embargo could suppress. In Burkina Faso, Revolution Square became a hub of ongoing civic action. Volunteers rebuilt schools, restored irrigation systems, and launched technology labs funded by diaspora contributions. Families worked side by side. Children participated in planning sessions, and elders offered guidance. Every small victory reinforced the continent-wide principle: Africa acts for itself, with dignity. As night fell over African capitals, the ripple connected cities, towns, and nations in a web of empowerment. Governments acted, citizens mobilized, and history was being rewritten. The looming question: could Africa sustain this unprecedented unity in the face of mounting retaliation from old powers, or would external forces attempt to fracture the movement before its full potential was realized? The coming months would determine not just the fate of one continent, but the blueprint for global shifts in power. It began quietly, almost imperceptibly. Citizens who had once waited for permission to act were now taking initiative across the continent. The UN speech and the Declaration of Dignity had ignited a spark. But this was the fire. Africa was no longer reacting. It was creating its own future. In Lagos, market, women held a council in the central square. We can no longer wait for foreign approval. Amina declared. Traders agreed to collectively refuse contracts that undermined local pricing. They documented negotiations meticulously, shared knowledge across networks, and empowered younger vendors to speak for themselves. Each transaction became a lesson in sovereignty. Each decision, a reinforcement of dignity. In Accra, students who had attended town halls turned lessons into action. They audited municipal budgets, tracked international aid flows, and published findings in community bulletins. Citizens began demanding transparency, not just from their government, but from multinational corporations. Parents brought their children to workshops to teach civic responsibility, planting seeds of awareness that would last generations. Nairobi's universities witnessed a psychological revolution. Students taught each other negotiation strategies, économique indépendance technique, and governance principles. Local leaders began consulting student councils before implementing policy, recognizing that this new wave of engaged citizens was a force beyond traditional authority. One professor observed, "They are no longer learning to follow, they are learning to lead." In South Africa, youth activists merged historical knowledge with modern advocacy. Elders taught lessons about colonial dispossession, while young leaders used technology to monitor land rights, environmental programs, and foreign investments. Citizens started holding local governments accountable, not through protests alone, but through organized civic action. The psychological breakthrough was clear. Africa was realizing that agency was not granted. It was claimed, even in smaller towns. The transformation was visible. Farmers organized cooperatives, sharing resources and coordinating exports to secure fair market prices. Schools taught sovereignty as a subject. Community centers hosted debates on policy, trade, and resource management. Citizens acted without waiting for instruction from distant authorities. Independence was no longer an abstract concept. It was practiced daily, in every market, classroom, and council hall. From my office in Ouagadougou, I observed these developments with a mixture of pride and calculation. Every video, every workshop, every policy shift confirmed that centuries of conditioned silence were unraveling. The people were awake, empowered, and organizing. The momentum had moved beyond symbolic gestures. It was structural. systematic, unstoppable. This is the breakthrough we needed. I thought, the moment when belief in our own capacity finally eclipses fear. Across borders, the psychological ripple spread. Indigenous communities in the Americas cited Africa's example in campaigns for land and resource rights. Aboriginal activists in Australia used the same rhetoric to challenge colonial-era laws. Pacific Island nations, facing climate challenges, applied African strategies to assert local autonomy. One speech, a single refusal to apologize, had become a global blueprint for agency, dignity, and empowerment. Even Western powers began to notice. Analysts convened emergency meetings, struggling to interpret the sudden continental shift. Embassies reported unprecedented citizen engagement, policy changes, and grassroots activism. Threats of sanctions, media campaigns, and economic pressure were in motion, but they could not reverse the psychological momentum. The people's minds had already been liberated. Fear was no longer effective. In Burkina Faso, Revolution Square became a classroom and workshop simultaneously. Mothers, fathers, and children participated in rebuilding schools, irrigation systems, and technology hubs. Volunteers recorded lessons for other communities, creating a ripple of knowledge and inspiration. Citizens were empowered not only to act, but to teach others how to act independently. The breakthrough was not just political or economic, it was deeply psychological. Africans had internalized a new reality. Dignity is not negotiable. Sovereignty is actionable, and agency is inherent. Communities were now operating with a consciousness that no foreign threat could suppress. Independence had moved from abstract principle to lived experience. As dusk fell across African capitals, I watched the movement expand, linking governments, citizens, and communities in a web of empowerment. The real test was yet to come. Could this psychological breakthrough withstand the inevitable counterattacks, manipulation, and coercion from entrenched global powers? The next days would determine whether Africa's newfound independence would solidify or be challenged by forces desperate to maintain the old order. The impact of Africa's refusal to apologize did not stop at its borders. The psychological breakthrough had set off a chain reaction, a domino effect rippling across continents. Citizens, governments, and communities were no longer isolated. They were connected in a web of empowerment, each action reinforcing the next. In Nigeria, student-led audit committees expanded their influence to local councils. Citizens demanded transparency in contracts with multinational companies. Market cooperatives refused to comply with exploitative pricing, and videos of these confrontations were shared across social media, reaching millions. Each action inspired neighboring towns to replicate strategies, creating a cascade of economic sovereignty. Ghana saw similar waves. University-led civic forums transformed into regional conferences. Students, teachers, and local leaders collaborated on resource mapping, economic planning, and governance initiatives. One professor recorded in a live stream, "The continent is speaking not with whispers, but with a unified voice." These young people are teaching their governments how to listen. Citizens took the lessons home, establishing workshops in villages and community centers, ensuring knowledge reached every corner. In Tanzania, farmers collectively renegotiated export contracts, demanding fair compensation and greater local retention of profits. Market women organized cooperative councils to educate their peers on negotiation, pricing, and collective strategy. Small successes compounded into regional influence. Villages that had once depended on foreign intermediaries now traded independently, creating economic ripples felt across East Africa. South Africa experienced a fusion of social justice and environmental activism. Elders taught historical lessons of colonial dispossession, while youth applied modern tools to monitor land and corporate practices. Local councils implemented policy adjustments based on citizen input. In Cape Town, workshops combined technology with traditional knowledge to create a governance model that was both contemporary and culturally grounded. The ripple effect strengthened continental cohesion. Even in smaller towns, the change was tangible. Schools integrated civic education on sovereignty and rights. Community councils encouraged citizen participation in local governance. Farmers revived traditional agricultural techniques. shared results in regional networks, and built alliances for resource management. Citizens acted collectively, understanding that each initiative was part of a larger, unstoppable movement. The African Union, observing these developments, took formal action to protect sovereignty and local industries. Policies were adjusted to regulate foreign investments, strengthen regional collaboration, and empower indigenous knowledge systems. Countries shared intelligence, resources, and best practices, creating a continent-wide network of coordination. The domino effect was no longer theoretical, it was institutionalized. Globally, the movement inspired action far beyond Africa. Indigenous communities in the Americas cited the UN speech and the New York Declaration to advance land and resource rights. Aboriginal activists in Australia drew on Africa's example to assert sovereignty and challenge colonial-era policies. Pacific Island nations, confronting climate crises, applied similar strategies to assert control over resources and governance. The domino effect had become a blueprint for global empowerment. From my office in Ouagadougou, I observed with a mixture of awe and calculation. Every viral video, every workshop, every policy change confirmed the profound truth. Centuries of conditioned submission were unraveling. Citizens were awake, empowered, and organized. The movement was no longer symbolic, it was structural, systemic, and unstoppable. This is the chain reaction we needed. I thought, the moment when one action ignites 1,000 others, even as Western powers scrambled, imposing sanctions and conducting media campaigns. The momentum persisted. Analysts and diplomats tried to contain the narrative, but citizen engagement, government action, and cross-border collaboration had created an ecosystem resilient to external pressure. The psychological and practical effects reinforced each other, creating a self-sustaining movement. In Burkina Faso, Revolution Square became a laboratory of empowerment. Volunteers rebuilt schools, restored irrigation systems, and established technology labs funded by the diaspora. Citizens acted with autonomy and pride. Mothers, fathers, and children coordinated projects together, demonstrating that independence was achievable at both local and national levels. As night fell across African capitals and the ripple extended globally, the question remained, could the domino effect continue unbroken? Or would entrenched powers attempt a coordinated strike to halt this unprecedented movement? The coming weeks would determine whether the awakening would solidify into lasting change or be challenged by forces desperate to reclaim control. The domino effect did not stop at Africa's borders. By the second week after the Declaration of Dignity, the psychological and practical ripples had reached continents far beyond the continent's shores. Governments, citizens, and activists worldwide began to take notice, inspired by a single truth. Africa was no longer silent, submissive, or dependent. In the Americas, indigenous communities cited the UN speech as a blueprint for reclaiming ancestral lands and asserting rights over natural resources. In Canada, activists organized forums where elders shared stories of stolen lands, while youth strategized campaigns for legal recognition. The rhetoric of refusal to apologize resonated powerfully, empowering communities long conditioned to accept marginalization. In Australia, Aboriginal activists invoked the principles of sovereignty demonstrated by Africa to challenge outdated legislation. Workshops and community councils emerged, teaching young leaders how to negotiate for land rights, manage resources, and assert agency in local governance. Traditional knowledge was coupled with modern strategies, echoing the African model that had inspired them. Pacific Island nations, facing rising seas and the legacy of colonial governance, began adopting African strategies to assert control over environmental and economic policy. Leaders referenced the declaration in regional forums, demanding accountability from multinational corporations and asserting the right to make independent decisions regarding natural resources. These nations, long overshadowed in global negotiations, found a blueprint for action in Africa's refusal to apologize. Back on the continent, African governments capitalized on this global attention. Policy measures were strengthened to ensure that local industries retained value and that citizens were directly involved in decision-making. Regional trade agreements were accelerated, bypassing traditional Western intermediaries, sovereign wealth funds were established to capture a greater portion of natural resource profits. Every government initiative reflected the continent's commitment to self-determination. In Burkina Faso, Revolution Square remained a hub of continuous civic activity. Volunteers, families, and diaspora contributors worked together to rebuild schools, irrigation systems, and technology labs. The square became a microcosm of the larger continental awakening, communities acting with autonomy, pride, and practical purpose. Every completed project reinforced the principle that independence was achievable when citizens trusted their own knowledge and initiative. Even multinational corporations and foreign investors began to notice. Reports circulated that African markets were becoming more resistant to exploitation, more organized, and more self-aware. Western analysts convened emergency meetings, realizing that the old levers of influence, aid, sanctions, media narratives were less effective than anticipated. Africa's refusal to apologize had created a psychological shift no economic strategy could immediately counter. From my office in Ouagadougou, I observed the unfolding effects with a mixture of awe and calculation. Every viral video, every community workshop, every policy change reinforced that Africa's awakening was both structural and psychological. Citizens were engaged, governments were aligned, and global observers were scrambling to comprehend a reality they had underestimated for centuries. The shockwaves are real. I thought, the world is finally beginning to measure our power not in money or diplomacy, but in resolve and agency. Within Africa, the psychological momentum continued to strengthen civic action. Citizens audited municipal budgets, farmers coordinated export initiatives, students engaged in policy research, and women's cooperatives gained influence in decision-making. Governments, sensing the empowerment of their citizens, began incorporating public input into policy planning. Every action, no matter how small, reinforced a new reality. Africa acted for itself. Western powers responded predictably with sanctions, diplomatic pressure, and media campaigns designed to discredit African leaders. Yet these measures only highlighted the magnitude of the awakening. Citizens, informed and empowered, continued to act independently. The very sanctions meant to intimidate reinforced the narrative of self-determination, showing that Africa's agency was neither negotiable nor contingent on foreign approval. As night fell over global capitals and African cities alike, it became clear that the world had entered uncharted territory. Africa's refusal to apologize had sparked a movement that could no longer be contained. The question loomed: would global powers adjust to this new paradigm, or would they attempt coordinated retaliation to suppress a continent now united in dignity and independence? The coming weeks would test not only Africa's resilience, but the world's willingness to accept a fundamentally changed balance of power. The day after the UN speech and the Declaration of Dignity, the consequences began to unfold. Western powers, accustomed to compliance and quiet obedience, were blindsided. Aid packages were frozen, development funds withheld, and the media launched a relentless campaign to depict Burkina Faso's leadership as reckless, unstable, even dictatorial. In Brussels, officials convened emergency meetings. Analysts calculated the financial impact of frozen European Union funds, predicting short-term disruption. Yet, they underestimated one crucial factor: the resilience and innovation of citizens who had decided to act independently. For the first time, Africa was proving that survival, progress, and dignity did not require Western approval. The sanctions were precise, yet symbolic. $27 million in development funds, frozen. Debt relief reviews, postponed. And bilateral agreements scrutinized for compliance. Media outlets labeled leaders as dangerous, warning that other African nations would risk isolation by following suit. In Washington, policy advisors debated responses, wondering how to reinstate influence over a continent no longer willing to yield. But in the streets of Africa, the response was diametrically opposed to what the West had intended. In Nigeria, market traders continued to negotiate fair contracts, refusing to compromise prices despite threats from foreign suppliers. In Ghana, University students organized additional workshops on governance and civic responsibility, reaching remote communities and inspiring youth to participate actively in policy initiatives. In Nairobi, the impact of citizen engagement was palpable. Farmers consolidated cooperatives, rerouted exports to preferred markets, and collaborated with regional partners. Market women coordinated campaigns to protect local industries and maintain economic autonomy. These actions reinforced the principle that Africa no longer required permission to exercise sovereignty. South Africa saw a similar surge. Activists merged environmental advocacy with political strategy, challenging exploitative contracts and colonial-era land laws. Workshops connected youth and elders, bridging generations to ensure continuity of knowledge, strategy, and agency. The Western narrative of instability failed to resonate. Instead, citizens felt empowered, seeing firsthand that their collective action could shape policy and economic realities. In Burkina Faso, Revolution Square became a hub of sustained activity. Citizens rebuilt schools, restored irrigation channels, and launched local technology initiatives funded by the diaspora. Mothers and fathers worked side by side with children and volunteers, demonstrating that independence could be achieved through knowledge, cooperation, and initiative. Each action reinforced the lesson: self-determination was possible and necessary. The psychological dimension of these consequences was profound. Generations conditioned to accept subservience were now awakening to the power of agency. Children observed leaders speaking truth without apology. Elders witnessed years of struggle validated. Communities recognized that autonomy was not abstract but achievable. Fear, the traditional tool of control, had lost its potency. Global reactions were immediate. Indigenous communities in the Americas cited Africa's stance in land rights campaigns. Aboriginal activists in Australia referenced African principles to assert sovereignty. Pacific Island nations facing climate crises implemented strategies inspired by the continent's refusal to apologize. The ripple of empowerment transcended borders, demonstrating that dignity and agency could not be contained by political or economic pressure. Yet the costs were real and immediate. Economic sanctions disrupted supply chains. Western media campaigns aimed to intimidate citizens and isolate leaders. Behind closed doors, pressure was applied directly to African governments, urging compliance through threats, promises, and covert operations. But each attempt only highlighted the resilience and ingenuity born from preparation, strategy, and collective action. From my office in Ouagadougou, I observed the unfolding consequences with a mixture of calculation and pride. Every challenge presented an opportunity to demonstrate that Africa could act decisively and independently, that its people could mobilize, innovate, and thrive without foreign approval. The price of dignity was high, but the return agency, respect, and sovereignty was invaluable. As dusk fell across African capitals and global observatories alike, one question remained. Could the continent sustain its momentum under relentless pressure, or would the cumulative weight of economic, political, and psychological challenges threaten to fracture the unity that had just begun to take shape? The coming months would reveal whether the awakening would endure or be tested beyond measure. The sun rose over Ouagadougou, casting long shadows across Revolution Square. The city, like the continent, was transformed. The streets buzzed, not with fear, not with protests, but with purpose. Citizens moved with determination, engaged in projects they owned, initiatives they led. Independence was no longer an abstract ideal. It was lived, breathed, and claimed. Schools reopened under local management. Teachers, once constrained by foreign curricula, now designed lessons around African history, governance, and innovation. Children learned not only math and science but sovereignty, dignity, and civic responsibility. In classrooms across the country, young voices debated policies, assessed community needs, and proposed solutions. For the first time in generations, education became a tool of empowerment rather than indoctrination. In the markets, women organized cooperatives, controlled pricing, and negotiated directly with domestic and regional buyers. Their actions demonstrated economic sovereignty in tangible terms. Farmers coordinated irrigation and crop-sharing initiatives, increasing yield and efficiency without foreign assistance. Technology hubs, funded by diaspora contributions, provided training and employment opportunities, ensuring the next generation of innovators could thrive independently. Across Africa, the ripple effect continued. Universities in Kenya held civic forums. Student activists in Nigeria monitored local governance. Cooperatives in Tanzania negotiated directly with international buyers. Each initiative, while local, reflected the broader continental ethos. Africa acts for itself, guided by dignity and strategy, rather than foreign approval. The African Union capitalized on this momentum, reinforcing policy measures that promoted regional cooperation, protected local industries, and ensured resource sovereignty. Governments shared intelligence, coordinated economic strategies, and strengthened infrastructure projects. The UN speech, the declaration, and the domino effect had created a structural foundation for lasting change. Globally, the impact persisted. Indigenous communities in the Americas cited African strategies in campaigns for land and resource rights. Aboriginal activists in Australia implemented advocacy programs inspired by African self-determination. Pacific Island nations applied similar frameworks to address climate change and governance challenges. Africa's refusal to apologize became a blueprint for empowerment, a testament to agency transcending borders. Yet, the path had not been easy. Sanctions, media campaigns, and diplomatic pressure had tested every leader, every community, every citizen. The cost of independence had been real, but each challenge reinforced resilience. Citizens realized that dignity required courage, agency required strategy, and independence required collective action. The lesson was clear. The price of freedom is never small, but its value is immeasurable. In Burkina Faso, I walked through Revolution Square, observing the activity with a quiet satisfaction. Volunteers coordinated reconstruction projects, children shared knowledge with neighbors, and elders mentored young leaders. Every face reflected agency, pride, and hope. I held the small flag given to me by the old freedom fighter months ago, a reminder that independence is a daily choice. We have chosen well, I thought. Citizens spoke freely, debated passionately, and acted decisively. Mothers and fathers engaged in local governance. Students audited municipal projects. Farmers controlled their crops, markets, and pricing. The diaspora returned with resources, expertise, and commitment. Every action reinforced the principle that sovereignty is lived, not granted. The global community watched in astonishment. Western powers adjusted, recalculated, and in some cases, grudgingly respected the new reality. Africa had not just spoken, it had acted, demonstrating competence, unity, and independence in ways that could not be ignored. Yet the journey was far from complete. Across continents, movements inspired by Africa's example were taking shape. Indigenous rights, climate justice, and economic sovereignty campaigns echoed the principles first articulated at the UN. The question lingered: could the world finally accept a paradigm where agency is inherent, dignity is non-negotiable, and Africa leads by example? Or would new challenges emerge, testing the unity and resolve that had been hard-won? Remember this moment. Remember that when a people refuse to apologize for their existence, they teach the world the meaning of dignity. When you see injustice, when you hear voices silenced, let the courage of Africa guide your own actions. Like, share, and tell this story, not to follow blindly, but to ensure that the lesson of resilience, strategy, and sovereignty lives on. Because hope is contagious, and legacy is built when we refuse to bow